These teachings, we're learning the laws of injury and damages, starting with chapter 1. Let's get right into it. They contain one positive commandment in this chapter 1, right, in all the chapters here, where the law of requiring payment when a person injures a colleague or damages his property. This mitzvah is explained in the chapters to follow. When a person injures a colleague, he is liable to compensate him with 5 ways: the damages, his pain, his medical treatment, his loss of employment, and the embarrassment he suffered. All these 5 assessments must be paid from the highest quality of property that he owns, as is the law with regard to the payment for damages. Now they can take it from your best property, right? So what is meant by damages? If a person cuts off the hand or the foot of a colleague, we theoretically consider the injured colleague as a servant being sold in the marketplace and evaluate his value before the injury and afterwards. And what the value is, right? The person who caused the injury must pay the depreciation in value. This is alluded to in the verse, an eye for an eye. The oral tradition interprets its tachas, translated as for, as an indication the verse requires financial recompense. Right? People say that eye for eye is, take out the person's eye. No, it means the value of the eye, right? That's what it means. That's the oral tradition. That's why you need the oral tradition to give us an understanding what the words of the Torah mean. We can't interpret it ourselves because our own interpretation will be, will be different one from another, right? My interpretation will be different than your interpretation. But we need the oral Torah to tell us what the proper interpretation is. So what does it mean, an eye for an eye? It means the value. So the example over here is someone cut off someone else's arm, how much would he be less valuable, right? Being on the market without an arm. That's the damage, right? That's only one component. That's one of the 5, right? That's the damage, right? The Torah statement, just as he caused an injury to his fellow man, so too the injury should be caused to him, should not be interpreted in a literal sense. It does not mean that the person who caused the injury should be actually subjugated to a similar physical punishment. Instead, the intent is that he deserves to lose his limb or to be injured in the same manner as his colleague was, and therefore he should make financial restitution. That's what it means, right? Again, bringing out the idea here is that we cannot, read a verse in the Torah and understand it just the way we understand it. We need the oral tradition. And that's what the Rambam is teaching us. The interpretation is supported by the verse, and Numbers do not accept a ransom for his soul of the murderer. Implied is that there's no ransom to be paid for a murderer alone, but the ransom may be paid for causing a loss of a limb and injuries by implication. Thus, the statement is with regard to the person who injures a colleague and causes him damage. Do not have compassion means do not have compassion in evaluating the amount that he is required to pay. You should not say, "Oh, he is poor and did it intentionally. He did not intentionally mean to injure him. Therefore, we will have mercy upon him. For this reason, do not have compassion." In other words, don't have compassion for the amount that he needs to pay. It doesn't mean don't have compassion for him and take off his arm. Right? How do we know? Excuse me. At the intent of the Torah statement with regard to a loss of a limb, an eye for an eye is financial institution. Same verse continues, a blow for a blow. In regard to the penalty of giving a colleague a blow, it explicitly states when a man strikes his colleague with a stone or a fist, he should pay for his being idled and for his medical expenses. Thus we learn that the word tachas mentioned with regard in the stead of, right? And with regard to blow indicates the necessity for financial restitution. And so one can conclude that the meaning of the same word with regard for an eye And a limb is also financial restitution. Okay. Although these interpretations are obvious from the study of the written law, and they are explicitly mentioned in the oral tradition transmitted by Moshe at Sinai, they are all regarded as halachas from Moshe. Right? In other words, this is not an interpretation of the rabbis. This was given at Mount Sinai, given to us that this is how you understand these verses. Right? Sometimes we have rabbinic law. This is not rabbinic law. This is oral tradition given at Sinai and how to understand these words. And of course, it's passed down by the rabbis from generation to generation, but it was given at Mount Sinai. And this is what our ancestors saw in the court of Joshua and the Gesod of Samuel, of Samuel of Ramah, and every single Jewish court that has functioned in the days of Moshe, our teacher until the present age. So if it really meant something else, or there's a difference of opinion on what this means, well, then you have different courts then ruling differently. Or throughout the ages, you would have different rules based on this. And in some courts, they would say, you stole with your hand, cut off his hand, right? They do that in another religion, right? Because they don't have the oral tradition. Therefore, they take these words literal. But that's wrong. Again, so he's bringing from he's bringing from the verse, he's bringing historically that we see that it was never dealt with in another way, but financial compensation that needs to be made when you damage or do any kind of damage or harm to a person. Okay. What is a source that teaches the person who injures a colleague they must pay independently for the pain that he caused, right? So, because you can do damage to somebody without any pain, and it can be with pain. But how do we know that you have to pay for pain? Maybe that's not, you don't have to pay for pain. So with regard to a maiden who says has been raped, states that the payment is imposed because he oppressed her. The same law applies for anyone who causes a colleague bodily pain, right? The oppression and the pain. Same law applies to anyone who causes a colleague bodily pain. He is required to give financial recompense for the pain he caused. We'll learn later on how you figure that out. Like pain. How much would you have? How much money would you give to have your would you give to have your arm cut off without pain? Right? That's how much the pain is worth to you, as opposed to with pain, right? That's how much it's worth it. Right? It's based on that kind of idea. Okay, number 8. What is the source that teaches us that liable for victims' unemployment expenses and medical expenses independently? It's written, and you should pay for him being idle and for his medical expenses. It says clearly. Shifty tin rapi. What is the source that teaches us is liable to pay for embarrassment suffered by a victim independently? And she extends her hand, grabbing his private parts. You must cut off her hand. The same laws applies for anyone who embarrasses another person. Right? What does it mean to cut off the hands? The person who has caused embarrassment is not liable unless he acts intentionally, as applied by the phrase, and she extends her hand. That's intentional, right? If by conscience a person embarrassed a colleague without intent, he's not liable. Therefore, if a person who has been sleeping or is like embarrassed, or and the like embarrassed a colleague, he's not liable. Okay. Very good. At least we got a good portion over there. All right. Amazing stuff. Thank you. Folks, we're still in our campaign. And so we still need help from everybody. Please reach out. Everybody here is given. But reach out to someone else to give. God bless you and thank you very much.